Up next, we have a presentation from Danielle Boyce, a qualitative evaluation of the revised ALS FRSR.
Hello, I'm Danielle Boyce. Thank you for coming to our presentation, What Do People Living with ALS Think of the ALS FRSR? It's an honor to be here with you today. We recently published this work, and you can go to the journal website, and we can actually drop a link in the chat, hopefully. This is open access, so you'll be able to see not only what I'm presenting today, but much, much more, and the supplemental data file. So I want to provide you with a little context why this is important, because many of you might be sitting here thinking, well, we successfully use the ALS FRSR in our clinic. We are very well trained. We have people come to our site whenever we do a clinical trial. And so what's the problem? Well, the original ALS FRSR manuals are not available. And the result is that there have been a lot of really terrific SOPs and training programs around the world. So not just US, but this is a global patient community. And they're not all harmonized. One of the things that struck me when I came into this work was the fact that there was no owner, which is the last bullet, but really it should be the first. There's no owner of this scale. And by owner, I don't mean someone who owns it and sells it. What I mean is someone who, a group that takes responsibility for versions, for scoring, for administration and manuals and SOPs and translations and all of those things. And before I worked in ALS, as a patient advocate, which many of you know me as a patient advocate for ALS and epilepsy, because I have a child with epilepsy. Before all of that, I developed instruments and worked on biostatistics at Johns Hopkins. So I actually am looking for certain things from a professional standpoint that when I first came into ALS work a couple of years ago, and this was brought to my attention, I thought it might be a valuable use of my time, a contribution that I could make, because I actually do kind of know a lot about this. And so the first thing I look for when I'm asked to work with an outcome measure, maybe use it in a study, is who owns it? Do I need to obtain permission? How do I administer it? How do I word it in my online survey? How do I translate that online, for example? And I didn't see any of that. I saw lots of versions all over the internet, and that's a concern. That is concerning, and that is best practice, and it's not being done here. I'm told that there are a lot of efforts underway to address it and to harmonize, and that's terrific, because as you'll see, that addresses a lot of the concerns that people have in this study. But I just wanted to point out that that was the first red flag. And it's also important to understand that these programs vary in terms of things like asking the patient to recall how many months or years before ALS diagnosis, or do they mean right now or since the last visit, for example. Do we provide cues to help facilitate the response? So they differ. So that can result in a different number. And I'm sure you can see that if you practice this. And clinicians use it outside of the research context, because this is a clinical outcome measure. So clinicians ask patients for, or they score it themselves. They take all kinds of different approaches, right? And that's probably okay if we're just talking about their individual relationship with the patient and they're using their own judgment and doing this over time. The challenge is when we take electronic health record data from multiple sources and put it together to bust those data silos that we hear the advocates talking about a lot. But when their interpretation and the way they ask it results in different numbers, then the same condition, the same patient, the same level of function would have from somebody else, and we try to mush them all together and do studies on them, now we have a problem, right? And digital biomarker and other self-reported observational studies, for example, if a patient advocacy group starts a study and pulls some version of the ALS FRSR up to use, is that the same version that a clinical trial might be using? Is that it? Are they using one of these self-administered forms, which are terrific? And actually, many of them address exactly some of the comments that have come up today, that you'll be hearing about today. But are they all being used? Are they used consistently? Is the same one used across self-administered studies? So there is a wide variation of experiences that could easily be reined in and standardized and harmonized to make a huge difference in the quality of the data that we're taking in. And keep this in mind that, when patients are aware of this, and so much is riding on that number because it's the most commonly used outcome measure in ALS clinical trials, we really owe it to the patient community to get this right. So this was a web-based survey. It had quantitative and qualitative responses. It was developed by the investigative team, but also people living with ALS and their caregivers, and shared on social media. What we settled on was just one big, broad, open-ended question for each of the items. Can you think of a situation in where you might not be able to answer this item accurately, or that your answer might not reflect your abilities? And then what we thought of this as is patients convening as expert evaluators. And that's really important to understand, because I've had some comments about sample size. Do you need a bigger sample size? Bigger sample size, as we say in the paper, would be great for a lot of reasons. One is we didn't collect a lot of clinical data. And as you'll see in a minute, depending on where you are in your patient journey, you might be more interested in certain items of the scale than others. So depending on how far your progression is, you might have more concern about speech and walking versus challenges you have with respiratory, because that area, that item is more of an issue for you now than it was earlier on. So the more people, the more comments we can get. And so my desire would be to get more comments there, and also to help prioritize based on, for example, where if you're limb or bulbar, where was your onset? And does that impact how meaningful and important these items are in your particular take? But at the same time, as much as the more data would be terrific, it's important to think about this as if we had convened 57, which was our sample size, 57 physicians to sit around a table to evaluate this instrument. It would be hailed as the biggest convention in history, right? So that is what we did here with patients as evaluators. So I know how to do studies with p-values and complicated statistics. That's what I do, but it wasn't called for here. What we were merely trying to do with this study was to have people who answer it all the time, patients, people who work with this instrument, therefore, all the time, provide their expert input, because they probably have issues with the same questions over and over. And that's what I heard anecdotally before I took this on. And so they have very valuable input as a result. So we had 57 participants, mostly people living with ALS, but some caregivers, and almost 3/4 expressed a concern about at least one item. And this is what I was talking about. So speech, swallowing, walking. I hesitated to quantify this too much, because again, it's a qualitative study, and so, but I thought it would be informative to see where the bulk of the passionate concerns fell, and this is where they fell out. So we can divide the responses into two categories: criticisms that could be addressed in a manual or instructions, which by and large, that's what we found, were things that could be addressed by some of these great SOP and harmonization efforts that are underway. And then also issues with the items that would require measure modification. And that's a little trickier, because that can't be fixed by just wording it differently. That's kind of the whole construct. And common criticisms: language uses of medical literacy level that's too high. Good example of this is MPO. So if you're using a version that includes MPO, patient doesn't know what that means, and there's no nurse because they're doing this at home and nobody to explain it to them, there's no consistent manual, then that's a challenge. That's not as big of a concern in the whole scheme of things, but it did come up. Response to the item is situational, like the time of day or your use of equipment. That was common. Walking and speech are impacted by how fatigued you are, for example. Same with respiratory, but walking and speech, that came up a lot. Difficult to distinguish between different response choices. What is the difference between this and that? You'll see that in a minute. And the structure or underlying assumptions of the item makes it difficult to answer. So Think about turning in bed and adjusting bedclothes. Those are two different things, but you're asked to speak for both of those things in one answer. That is a good example. So in their own words, speech can vary depending on time of day, duration, setting, what you eat and drink. Came up a lot. Some situations where this item could be inaccurate is whether or not the ALS patient is using a BiPAP ventilator or a face mask, and what kind of face mask, or if they're eating and trying to speak. Swallowing. So they're saying, yes, answer B describes two different problems, early eating problems, which is very vague, too vague. What is an early problem versus a late problem? Clearly, dietary consistency may change before occasional choking, so that makes it hard to respond. Handwriting, legibility before ALS. So what if you never had good handwriting? That's a good question. Does this really accurately capture your handwriting decline, your functional decline, if you always did have poor handwriting, right? And then also, what happens if your dominant hand that you write with is unaffected, but your non-dominant hand is affected? Does that really reflect your ability to use your hands by asking about handwriting? So they answered on all of the items, and you can see that in the paper online. So a lot has happened since the original scale was developed. This isn't a we hate ALS FRSR, bashing presentation. This is really just to say that if you had ALS and you knew that a lot was hanging on that number, both in terms of drug approvals and also just to understand your own decline, and you could see with your own two eyes that this is not representative, or it could be answered in different ways depending on the situation. Think about what that would do to you, how the uncertainty would affect you. And so we owe it to people living with ALS to validate that. And that is what we've done here. But a lot has happened since the scale was developed. We have text messaging, we have equipment and devices, we have self-reported studies. None of these things could ever have been contemplated. So is it time for a refresh? Maybe. But I think that the real opportunity here is what is being done already, which I've learned about some activities to harmonize, to have all the experts in the world get together, harmonize the SOPs and the manuals and the instructions, so that a lot of these challenges can be addressed. And to find somebody, so find an owner or a home for this, that would go a long way to address some of the issues. But there are other things to explore. We have other measurements. We have the roads. We're looking at biomarkers. So how can we, understanding what we know about the challenges with the ALS FRSR, how can we accommodate those while not throwing everything away, right? Can we use the roads also as a outcome measure in our studies? Can we exercise some flexibility in how we interpret trial results based on what we know? Does it call for a change in how we analyze or present data? So all of these things are on the table, and we didn't solve any of them with our little project. But our hope was to get people talking and to provide that really important qualitative evaluation data that can be used to inform these future efforts. Thank you so much. And I am very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if I should start with the same questions I had during our PCAC meeting, Danielle. Are there any questions from the audience on the ALS FRSR? There's one on the line. There's none online. Okay, so I will get to start. So, I think it's fantastic, obviously. I think we always have to ask people who are being asked this what their opinions are. And of course, physicians are asked. Are you ever thinking about asking the evaluators who administer this over and over again, especially the experienced ones? Like I have 25 years or more of experience of administering it, so.
Yeah, I think that would be another great direction to take with a larger study, is to include, to convene people like you, for example, in this, because I'm sure you get the same questions, or how do I answer this, or do you mean that? So I think you would be the perfect person to and type of group to help to evaluate and refine, or whatever is decided is to be done. That's beyond my scope, but definitely.
Are there any other
I think
questions?
statisticians. I think there's lots of groups: nurses, statisticians, caregivers.
Oh yeah, Gethin Thomas from MND Australia. Do you think the objective would be to develop a simpler scale so there's less variability between users, or would you want something that perhaps better captures disease progression? Is
So
that the objective?
yeah, I don't really have an opinion about the best approach there, but I do think that I can say this, I think there are better ways to ask some things, like the handwriting. And I think that there are other items like text messaging that some of the folks in the study and anecdotally have expressed to me are a better reflection of their abilities when they lost the ability to send a text message versus their handwriting, for example. So I don't know if it's simpler. I think it's a really hard thing to tackle, which is probably why it hasn't been completely resolved in all this time, because it's really, it's not an easy thing to revise and validate a measure that is applicable to everyone. But I do think that part of that simplification is just doing SOPs and instructions consistently. That would go a long way.
And there's certainly some other things that have changed. I don't know if you looked into that, but one of the things they ask is just BiPAP use. There's no other NIV included.
Yeah, that came up, that like they just simply could not answer based on just equipment, adaptive utensils, climbing stairs. What if you use equipment to climb the stairs? That's just, if you're not taking that into account in whatever manual or instructions you're using, you could either score 4 or 0, depending on how you interpret those questions. Definitely.
We're a quiet group here today. Oh, there's an online question.
Yeah, there's actually 2 questions.
Okay.
The first one is from Lane.
Hi, Lane.
So where do we go from here, Danielle? What do you recommend as next first steps to reevaluate the system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's really for folks who are smarter than me, but I do know that some of my colleagues, Dr. Cedarbaum, Ruben Van Eyck, Chris McDermott, Angela Genge, and others have been talking about convening experts, working together with the community. By experts, I mean, we already convened our experts, right? But additional experts, experts in your professional community, experts in the neurology community, and biostatisticians, and take what we have and have a meeting of the minds. And like I said, I keep sound like a broken record, but finding a group to kind of lead and the ownership and organization of all of this, and the versions and the translations, and just kind of get our arms around it, I think is the first step. And that can be done now. That's just getting together and, working groups and discussions. I think that's the important first step. And see how that goes. See how those instructions and SOPs improve the results of some of the data that Dr. Van Eyck has published, and you'll see some in some upcoming talks if you're coming to the meeting this month. That's a great question, and of course, keeping patients and caregivers involved every step, so you don't miss something like, what if my handwriting was never good? Just things that patients come up with.
We get that a lot as well. One more question?
Yes, this one's from Jennifer. Is ALS FRSR sensitive to measure disease progression for people living with bulbar ALS?
So I think that that's a tough question. I'm going to say yes, right? It's meant to measure, the disease progression of ALS with the caveats that I shared today. So there are concerns about the measure itself and how sensitive it is and how accurate it is and could we improve it? But yes, it is considered the foremost outcome measure for ALS. And there is a speech domain that captures
Yeah, there's
bulbar.
3 questions that are speech,
Yeah.
3 that are fine motor, 3 that are
Yeah.
gross motor, and 3 that are
Yeah,
respiratory.
so they're specifically targeted for those symptoms.
All right, that comes to the end of this particular presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.